story of our nation's history in the American Heritage Series.
When God tells history in the Bible, He doesn't gloss it up. He tells it just the way that it happened. He tells the good, the bad, the ugly.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent.
There's no way you can separate political parties from black history unless you want to be politically incorrect, and then that requires a sacrifice of the truth. And I'm not going to do that.
Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s.
Nearly every Southern Republican Party was started by blacks, not whites.
What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith? And why have so many of their stories remained silent? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
The history of black Americans begins in 1619 when the first load of slaves sailed up the James River into Jamestown, Virginia, slavery introduced into America. The first history of African Americans is involuntary. For the next 150 years, black American history is really centered around the states because we don't have a nation, we don't have any kind of a national government. It's very much like it would have been in Europe. All the different states were really like nations. So the first real concerted national effort to end slavery occurs with the beginning of the national government. The first efforts to end slavery really began in 1787 when they had the Constitutional Convention. All the states have come together and they're trying to figure out how do we have a nation now. And within that group you had some pro-slavery, you had a lot of anti-slavery.
Right.
Overwhelming majority of states were anti-slavery, but some were pro-slavery. But again, they were just states back then, so they couldn't affect their neighbor. They could end it in their state, and they did. When we signed the Declaration of Independence, a number of states started wiping out slavery right then. We had to have slavery before that because the king would not allow us to end slavery. Well, now that we separate from Great Britain, we can end slavery. So here you have Massachusetts, and you have Vermont, and you have Connecticut, and all these states ended slavery. Now they're in this federal constitutional convention with some states that are pro-slavery, with a whole bunch that are anti-slavery. There was a lot of fight that went over that. One of the clauses in the Constitution to which critics today point to say slavery is part of the Constitution, always had been, it's part of the national psyche, always been this attitude of enslaving African Americans. They point to what's called the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was actually an anti-slavery clause that was put in the Constitution. But we never hear that today. We never hear that 3/5 was anti-slavery. But it's interesting, the testimony of those who would know best, the ones that I would look to if I wanted to know what African Americans thought about the 3/5 clause, I'd go to somebody like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, great civil rights leader. We know him from back around 1838. He escaped from slavery and he went to New York, and as he was against slavery in New York, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard him speak and said, oh, you need to go on the road full time and speak against slavery. So here's Frederick Douglass, who had been in Maryland a slave, has now escaped to the North. He's free. So he goes on the road full time to speak against slavery. Now, interestingly, in the 2 years that he was in New York, what's called the radical abolitionists were the ones who trained him. And they said the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. It is filled with the Founding Fathers' desire to keep slavery. He had been trained in that for 2 years. But when he agreed to go on the road full time for the Massachusetts Abolition Society, he had the integrity to say, you know, I've been taught about these documents, but I better read them for myself.
Wow.
And so he went back and read the documents. He read the debates. He read all the things that went on. In his autobiography, he said that he underwent a radical change of opinion. Instead of finding that the documents were pro-slavery, he said he found them to be anti-slavery in every provision. He said, by the way, if they are pro-slavery, why does the word slave or slavery, why does none of that appear anywhere in the Constitution? And they don't appear. In the 1860 presidential election, there was a split in the Democratic Party, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. Both factions supported slavery, but while Southern Democrats were willing to split the United States to form their own nation, Northern Democrats refused to do so. Northern Democrats voted for Stephen Douglas for president, while Southern Democrats voted for John C. Breckinridge. With this split in the Democratic vote, Republican Abraham Lincoln was then elected with only 40% of the popular vote, but 59% of the Electoral College vote. Republicans also won a majority in the U.S. House and Senate in that election, thus giving Republicans control of the lawmaking process for the very first time. Given the bold anti-slavery and pro-civil rights positions set forth by Republicans in their platforms, it was obvious to Democrats what was about to occur. The anti-slavery and pro-civil rights position of the Republicans were about to become reality. What was the Democratic response? Southern Democrats left Congress and took their states with them, forming a nation that described itself as the slave-holding Confederate States of America. While Northern Democrats did not support secession, they nonetheless generally supported slavery and imposed civil rights for black Americans. In short, the main difference between Southern and Northern Democrats at that time was their view on secession, not slavery. However, returning to the election of 1860, with Republicans firmly in control of the federal government, they quickly began implementing significant changes. In 1862, Republicans abolished slavery in Washington, D.C., and in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing all slaves in the southern states in rebellion. The Emancipation Proclamation was eagerly anticipated, and many black Americans gathered in groups around clocks or watches, eagerly awaiting the arrival of midnight on December the 31st, 1862, for the proclamation was to take effect on the first moment of January the 1st, 1863. Frederick Douglass was in attendance at one such midnight rally, waiting for the proclamation to become official. When that moment arrived, a celebration erupted, and Douglass exclaimed,
"It was one of the most affecting and thrilling occasions I ever witnessed, and a worthy celebration of the first step on the part of the nation in its departure from the bondage of the ages."
In 1860, in that election where the Democrats had their platform, said Dred Scott's great, Republicans had theirs, says no it's not. You had the election that time between the Democrats and the Republicans. Abraham Lincoln running as a Republican. The Democrats actually broke and split. There was the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats said slavery is absolutely fine and we're willing to leave the Union if these Republicans try to end slavery. You had the Northern Democrats up through New York and elsewhere that said, we think slavery's fine, but we're not willing to break up the Union over it. So when he gets elected, the Southern Democrats said, we told you we're going to leave if he gets elected, because if he gets elected, he's promised to end slavery. So you had 11 Democrat states secede from the Union. Now, we now say the South seceded from the North. No. Every Southern Democrat in the House, every Southern Democrat in the Senate left and started a new nation. I have the founding documents of that nation. They call it the slave-holding nation of the Confederacy. That's in their title. The speech given by their vice president, Alexander Stephens, said that slavery is the cornerstone of the Southern Confederacy. So you have 11 states that have broken away to have a slave nation. That's what the Civil War is about. So now Republicans, in one election, not only was Abraham Lincoln elected, but Republicans took the House and the Senate in one election. So within 7 years, they've gone to be in the majority party. They started cranking out civil rights laws like crazy. This is one of the early civil rights laws. This is a law to secure equality before the courts. In other words, race no longer had anything to do with the courts. It was prior to this that if you were black, you couldn't testify in court, you couldn't go before a court to bring a suit, you were excluded from the legal process. Here's a bill that's designed to give equal pay for soldiers. If you're black or if you're white, you're going to get paid the same.
What are the dates of these?
This bill is 1864. This is March the 5th of 1864.
And is that an original?
That's the original. This is the original as introduced in the Senate. This is Senate Bill 145. And this is the original Senate bill. Here's the House bill. This is H.R. 51. This is the bill that created the Freedmen's Bureau, another civil rights bill. So Republicans are cranking out civil rights bills like crazy.
Many of our greatest revolutionary heroes were patriots of African descent. Many courageous and effective black leaders played pivotal roles in our government as early as the late 1800s. What is the story and inspiration behind these great patriots and heroes of the faith, and why have so many of their stories remained silent?